when I look at Julius Hobson, he was very unique for that particular time because Julius, I mean, as Stokely said, Julius did his research. He did study and he did try to understand the environment that he was in. Most people who came to the movement at that point came because of outrage, because of some incident that had happened to them, and they felt that they needed to protest. While and so what they had before them was what they was impacted by, what they were impacted by. They didn't see all the reasons they were impacted by that. And Julius and people like Miss Hamer and people like W.B. Du Bois and people like Paul Robeson understood the whole societal reasons that that person was impacted. I think the second thing that made Julius, distinct in Washington, is that in Washington, in just on the racial issues, at that point, early up to that point, the NAACP was the leading civil rights organization. And the Congress of Racial Equality and SNCC decided that we would not just engage in court actions, we would take it to the streets. And we would take it to the streets, whether it was sit-ins, whether it was freedom rides, whether it was demonstrations against housing, whether it was demonstrations against the multitude of things that existed here. And that's why Julius and Hobson and SNCC got along. I mean, well, I guess NAG at that point got along so well because he was 40 years old. Most of us were 19 and 20. But we understood and we saw that this was a deep issue that went beyond what we saw before us. People like Ms. Baker told us what we were dealing with was more than a hamburger. We were dealing with an economic and racial system that really was designed to exploit the many for the benefit of the few. And while we didn't understand that Julius did about socialism and Marx and Engels and all these kinds of things, we understood that this was a deep issue and that we had to deal with it. And we were, as Stokely said in the film, simpatico. And the last thing I'd like to say is this. In the early 60s, Black people were only supposed to, first of all, they were not supposed to speak. And when they spoke, they were only supposed to speak to issues of civil rights. And when people like Julius Hobson started talking about the Vietnam War, when even Martin King started talking about the Vietnam War, they were always asked by the white community, including the Washington Post and the New York Times and a bunch of other people, how dare you speak outside of your lane? They tried to tell us what we could say and when we could say it and why we could say it. So my sense is why people ask the question, well, why is he always mad? Why was he always so vocal? Because it took that kind of energy to make a difference. And so we'll talk later on about other issues, but I'll stop there.
I got involved with Julius in a sort of an offbeat way. In 1970, I wrote an article about how DC could become a state without a constitutional amendment. And the total reaction I got to the article was that somebody sent me $5 and said, if anything happens to this, give this to the cause. And I said, well, there's another one down the drain. And 4 months later, I'm sitting in the basement of a church with a bunch of people planning a non-voting delegate campaign for Julius Hobson. And we talked about his campaign for a little while. And then he says, well, what am I going to run on? And some guy in the back of the room said, well, Sam wrote this interesting article about how DC could become a state. And we talked about it for no more than 15 minutes. And Julius said, that's it. That's what I'm running on. And that was my introduction to Julius Hobson. I think the thing that, in thinking about him, is that he was a leader towards new directions rather than merely a protester against old directions. And he was aided in this by the fact that he was a economist and a mathematician. I mean, he understood math, and he so became a fact-based activist. And you saw this most dramatically in his fight for school integration. Um, but I think this is something that makes him a little bit different than a lot of activists because he was so fact-based. Um, and then he also had this touch of show business about him, as you could see in the movie. He knew how to say things succinctly in a very short period of time.
Good evening to everyone, and I see many friends on the screen here, and thank you for including me. I'm a little bit different among these panelists. Carissa mentioned I met Julius Hobson when I was a law student at Georgetown 100 million years ago, it feels like, in the mid-1970s. But the story is even a little bit different, and he was one of the magnets who really pulled me in to DC education. When I was a law student, I had taught street law in my second year of law school, and it was my introduction to the DC public schools. And I began to understand what some of the educational challenges were in our local public schools by teaching the law course that year. And the following year, then I had the opportunity to have an internship, and I was assigned to work with Julius Hobson. I had heard of him, and I had also followed the creation of the new council immediately after the creation of the Home Rule Act. So I went to meet with Councilmember Hobson and also his then legislative aide, Pat Miner. And they said, oh, we want you to do research on legislation for educational accountability. Well, that touched my heart because I had taught in the schools the prior year. I thought educational accountability sounded like a good idea. I was so naive. I had no idea of the political hornet's nest I was stepping into. And of course, Councilmember Hobson did not feel the need to explain that to me. So I went off and did the research and drafted legislation, the Educational Accountability Act of 1977. And the minute he introduced it, of course, all hell broke loose because what it intended to do was to have the DC school board report to the council and have the council exercise oversight over the schools. It was fascinating. The political storm that erupted after that over who had the power to oversee the schools was fascinating. He called hearings, but the school board would not come to testify. The then superintendent, that was the period of the transition from Barbara Sizemore to Vincent Reed in the superintendency. There were so many notable actors then, all struggling to figure out how do we improve education for children in the district, and at the heart of it was Julius Hobson. Unfortunately, while I was working on that project, he passed away, so we never completed that particular round. But somebody said earlier here, quoting Debbie, that anyone who has the opportunity to meet and work with Julius Hobson was forever changed. And I felt that he left a lasting impression with me. I am devoted to education, have been for the rest of my professional life in the city. And he is one of the notable figures who has definitely shaped my educational philosophy. And we still need to work on educational accountability. That crusade that he had is far from over.
Dr. G, you're up next.
All righty. Thanks for the baton, and thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here with you all. I would like to, first of all, give a shout out to the MLK branch of the DC Public Library, the Washingtoniana Division. That is where I indeed was able to find many of the papers where I was able to learn about Julius Hobson. So shout out to Brother Derek Gray, librarian, for all the care and assistance, for being able to learn about this interesting historical character. And so in terms of my portion, I just have 10 historical factoids that I thought would be interesting for people to, digest. First of all, understand that when you talk about Maverick for Justice, Hobson was a Maverick ever since birth, if you think about it. He was actually one of two twins that was born to his mother. However, the tragic story is she was having complications, and they had to drive to the colored hospital. Remember, Jim Crow was a very real thing, still is in existence if you listen to Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow. But the idea is that back in the day, it was very much, physically segregated. Well, I guess still is today in many ways. Not to get off the point. The point is that his twin passed away, and he always felt his mother was, quote, never right after that. And so he would use the pain that his mother carried with her as a way to motivate him throughout life. So ever since birth, I mean, just think about how he just came out the womb already born into a world of conflict based upon race. And so, in many ways, he was ordained to speak to this and confront this. And so the second factoid is that he was born in Alabama, and he was actually christened at the same 16th Street Baptist church that was bombed, that killed the 4 little girls. And so think about how from the formative stages of his life, he's having to confront this idea of racism in all of its ugly manifestations. And so it's no secret or surprise that later on in life that he would be quite adamant, right, as Cox had said, about confronting this in a very direct and explicit manner. He wasn't going to sugarcoat, or soft shoe it. He was going to speak directly to something that he knew was very violent and disruptive. Third point is that at Howard University, he, first studied Marxism. He had a professor at Howard University from Germany who introduced him to the concept. And the reason why I was appealing to him was not so much that he was into communism or anything, but it was this idea that Marxism provided an alternate critique against capitalism, right? In terms of its relationship to racism, right? And how, it essentially oppresses, how the powerful oppress, those who don't have the means. And by the way, if you hear any noises or if it looks as if I'm in my car, it's because I am in my car. I'm taking on the spirit of Hobson and trying to make it happen by some way, make a way out of no way. I had a family obligation and the timing just did not work out where I could get to my office. But the fact of the matter is that we make time for what's important. So point number 4, even though he had a college degree, he still entered the federal workforce as an entry-level desk attendant. So again, this goes to show how back in the day that, how education wasn't valued for all people. And so this is, again, part of what fueled him to make what was wrong right. Also, I'd just like to point out factoid number 5, that with the Hobson v. Hansen case that was mentioned earlier, he actually did all the research, right? He actually hired William Kunstler, who famously argued against burning of a flag being a First Amendment, but he actually did all the research, and Kunstler was actually one who actually argued it in court. Next, you should know that Hobson was not new to this. He was true to this. He was part of over 80 picket lines, picketed over 120 retail stores. And he ended up having a hand in over 5,000 Blacks, obtaining jobs that they otherwise were not able to have. So that is tremendous when you look at those numbers alone. And also, I'd just like to add that even though things didn't work out in terms of him staying with CORE for the long term, he eventually essentially set up his one-man band. All he said he needed was like 6 people in a phone booth. And so when he did, he formed the group ACT. And so that was when he did most of his advocacy for government workers. Number 7, I believe, is that because he was so very good at math, he was painfully aware of what we call black collar jobs. These were jobs that were categorized by low wages and slower raises. And this is what he definitely advocated against, having been a victim of this, starting off at a low desk entry position despite having a college degree. The other piece I would like to speak to what Sam Smith mentioned was that he was very savvy in manipulating the media. So when you talk about why is he driving around town with rats on top of his car, it was part of what he staged as a rat relocation rally. So what happened was rats were rampant all over Black parts of DC. So what he said was, it's not a problem unless it's a white problem. So what he did was he went to Sears, got some traps, and it was only about 10 to 12 rats, but he called the media and staged this big rat relocation rally and went to Georgetown, driving slowly, claiming that he was going to unload all the rats in the white part of town. lo and behold, the problem got solved very quickly, right? And so again, that was just his savvy way of bringing the media in to leverage his voice. He also set up a parabolic microphone on top of his car, drove around in neighborhoods, recording officers in terms of their abusive, language and verbiage and harsh invective towards Black citizens. And then he would actually stage rallies. He actually used his friend, Colin, colleague, who used to babysit for his younger kid, Julius Hobson Jr., who I think is on call. And then he would actually play the recordings. Think about how forward-thinking this is. This is before iPhones. This is before recording and things of that nature, Spotify, YouTube, and, TikTok, whatever. And so he was using technology as a way to embarrass the cops who actually showed up to do a security detail, right? So again, a very fascinating way in terms of how he would leverage, technology. So the last factoid I have for you, and then, we can, return, is I would like to just share with you what the Washington Post said upon his passing. So when he died in 1973, the Washington Post eulogized him as a man who made a career of impatience, of speaking when other men held back. The obituary concluded, right? Check this out. He was outrageous, inflammatory, melodramatic, insulting. A lot of the time, he was also right. That's Julius Hobson.
I'm gonna start going back with Cortland, if you don't mind, Cortland. You talked about his research and his fact-based action. Can you talk a little bit more about how he influenced you and other young activists at Howard at that time?
Well, I think that, most of the actions that were going on really were in the South. And they were dealing with, questions of voting and questions of the ability to do a number of things, mainly public accommodations and so forth. What Julius was able to do was be able to act in an urban area, which was important in the sense that he took on the question of education and the track system. The question of education is still, as somebody said, still a big problem, the quality education. And basically, whether we were talking about the North or the South, in the South, you had sharecropper education. In the North, you had track system and vocational education. And the ability to define that clearly was something that was very, very important in terms of what Julius was doing. And I think what my sense was that he was able to figure out how to function in an urban environment. One of the things that we used to call him Julius Hollywood Hobson. And we did that because of some of the things that were explained, whether you were taking stuff to the rats to Georgetown, or whether you describe somebody as colorless, odorless, and some other less. He had a way with words. So, I think that the things that we learned from him probably most was how do you function in an urban environment with a number of sophisticated things, particularly things like the Washington Post, who tried to define you, as other. That is, you begin to understand. Because in the South, you understood it was a whole system. But the Washington Post pretended, and people like that pretended they weren't like that. But what they were the cousins to the people in the South.
Sam, would you be able to speak any more to Julius's use of agitation? You mentioned the rat action, which of course was meant to make people uncomfortable. Can you share any other examples of how he used agitation and actions that really took people out of their comfort zone in his activism? And unmute yourself, Sam.
He used language very much in this sort of way, but he also found different ways to attack a problem. Classic example being in the schools desegregation. And One thing that we should keep in mind, I think, as we discuss this, I was, after our rehearsal last week, I picked up a Kindle version of Dr. G's book and found it very interesting about the role of the federal government and its failures in terms of Black employment. And I think it's important to know that DC was a different sort of place for a number of reasons, that being one of them. But the other, which was on the positive side, was Howard University.
What do you think? Is there a remnant of Hobson's legacy that you still see today in activism around education in the city? And what of the issues that we're impacted by here in the city today in education do you think Hobson would be most inclined to tackle?
Well, first of all, I wish he had lived, and I wish he had been successful in getting the legislation enacted. And I say that not because of what I knew in 1977 as a law student, but what I know today in 2020 as a college president. You may know Trinity enrolls more DC residents than any other private university in town. And most of our students are from wards 4, 5, 7, and 8. And as much as we work with the DC public schools, and I certainly love and cherish both our students and the teachers who are working so hard, I do not think that the way it worked out for the schools with mayoral control was necessarily the direction Julius Hobson would have gone, to be sure. And it's not clear that that is the best direction at all. I think the spirit of having the people more engaged with their schools lives in the city, and the education councils, in some of the ANCs, some of the community activists, some of the parent groups. But the fact is that once the reform occurred, when was it, in 2007, 2008, when Adrian Fenty took over the schools and brought in Michelle Rhee, it was a sea change. It disempowered the school board entirely. So back in 77, the school board was worried that if it reported to the council, it would be disempowered. But then, fast forward 20 or 30 years, the council or the school board became almost irrelevant. And that's not necessarily good for the long term. I do not see the kind of activism that Julius Hobson brought. When he died, there was a column by Bill Raspberry in the Washington Post that I remember also, and this relates to tactics, because everybody today, tactics gets bleached through 100 million consultants. Well, Hobson didn't use consultants; he just did what his gut told him was the right thing to do, which is why he was a disruptor. And he actually told Bill Raspberry, and was quoted, at the end of the day, he didn't care whether the school board reported to the council or whoever. He just wanted education to be improved. And he was going to try whatever tactic would be sufficiently disruptive to call attention to the fact that education was not improving fast enough.
You actually making a comment about mayoral control and speaking your mind about that, because even that in of itself, a lot of people who work in education or in the realm may be afraid to even just say, hey, this may not be the right thing, but certainly appreciate that. That was very Hobbesian of you to speak the truth.
Oh, I'm an old soul. I say a lot of things that are on my mind, and people are just like, there she goes again. I think he influenced me a little bit that way.
I think that he did, in fact, have a balancing of the two, the logic and the emotion. I mean, after all, when you think about the Hobson v. Hansen case, it was fueled by what? Him passing this school that was closest to him by residents with his son. He's passing the school with his son, and he's like, this doesn't make any sense. I'm walking a further distance to the segregated school. This has got to stop. This is not practical. So I think that comes from him being emotionally connected to his own family, right? His own child, right? And his own neighborhood, right? And going back to the government worker piece, I mean, he lived the life, right? As someone who was overqualified and was essentially stunted by a system that was not recognizing, the true value of Black labor. And I think, that being able to channel that emotion and couple it with the statistical data to show that no matter what type of educational background that an African American usually had, that they were often still stunted. They were labeled as a black collar worker. I think he was able to merge the two. And so I think in many ways, when you combine the two, what makes for a very more powerful argument is that it's not just you're angry, but it's more of a pointed critique based upon that which is logically sound and fueled by righteous indignation, right? I think we need to revise how we characterize individuals like him. Using words like angry, irritated, I think does the advocacy a disservice. So I prefer this idea of righteous indignation, this idea that it was very much informed critique, based upon that which was logical and sound.
I want to ask you, maybe you could share with us, what was the relationship like between Julius Hobson and Marion Barry? And now we're getting into some of the questions that have come through the chat, so keep those coming.
I mean, Julius was a mathematician. Marion was a chemist.
Yeah.
In fact, Marion did not do his dissertation for a PhD in chemistry. So, I mean, both of them understood, science and did a number of things and organized their way. I think Sam puts it, as you try to look forward.
I think it's important to remember that the first council after Home Rule, which Julius was part of and Marion Barry was part of, also had a number of great activists. We are focusing on Julius Hobson, but he was part of a group that tried to shape a new empowered District of Columbia, and you had other activists like John Wilson, you had Hilda Mason, you had Polly Shackleton, you had Dave Clark. I mean, it was a powerful group of activists, not just one, but many. Julius was, very top of the heap, if you will. Marion Barry was still a young man at that time and had not come into his mayorship yet. But there were a lot of extraordinary figures in that council in 1994 through 97, 77, 78 in the 70s. And we don't have figures like that today, I think is my point.
It was
we don't
9
see
out of 13.
activism.
9 out of 13 of the first city council members were activists.
Yeah, they were extraordinary.
So I have to then ask this question about how would Julius Hobson characterize today's city council and today's politicians, today's mayor? Anybody? Corlin?
What were the terms he used? Colorless, odorless. So my sense is I have not seen, and there may be, I could be wrong. I have not seen anyone on the council who has challenged the kind of exploitation that really is much more modern and sophisticated and much more defined as betterment. But it really, as the old days, we used to say, urban renewal, it was Negro removal. And that is what's happening. And I don't see anybody making challenges to that discussion.
I'm going to read one more question, and then I think we should ask some of our special guests to speak a little bit as well. The question is, could Dr. G or others please explain how things got so bad in DC by the 1960s, where things had reached a state, as Eleanor Holmes Norton described it, of apartheid, and prominent African-American leaders in the early 20th century claimed DC was unusually oppressive for African-Americans. This is what Julius Hobson and other activists were challenging during the 60s and 70s. Please explain, was DC worse than other places?
Okay, so I can jump in first on that. And I don't think DC was worse than other places, but DC by the 60s was becoming more Black than other places. Let's not forget that in 1971, you're talking about DC population reached the apex of 71% African American, thereby earning the nickname, what? Say it with me, y'all, Chocolate City. Gentrification is now pushing out the African American imprint, which has been so very much a part of the irony of the story, that the nation's capital, right, has most of the workers where the face of the government is literally African American, and the representative and symbolic power of that, I think, plays into the comments you just heard with respect to Marion Barry, Mayor Fenty, and many other mayors who have been impugned for and essentially have had to fight these narratives about them not being fit for leadership, them not having the ability, the intellect, or the wherewithal to be able to lead a city that is mostly African American.
I do want to invite Julius's family members who are with us to say a few words. Tina Hobson, Julius Hobson Jr., I believe maybe also his daughter Jean may have joined us. Tina or Julius Hobson Jr., you want to unmute yourself and say a few words?
It's Julius. I can't start the video, but I did unmute the microphone.
We hear you. Thank you. Go ahead.
Let me say a couple of things. One, Dr. G, I had not heard about your book. I just ordered it on Amazon. Thanks, Cortland, for your comments. And I do want to say this. Yes, my sister Jean Richardson is on, as is my daughter Faye Rencher and granddaughter Sienna Rencher. They're here somewhere. I would say that life was interesting as the son. When I was elected to the school board, shortly thereafter, I became vice president of board and chair of the finance committee. And Julius Hobson Sr. was chairman of the council education committee. And more than once, I had to present the board's position on our budget to his committee. Just simply say it was an interesting hearing, and no, he didn't cut his son any slack. And I can say I gave as good as I got. The other thing is an irony of ironies. After he had passed, in an attempt to fix the management of Walter Fauntroy's office, he had a panel pick his chief of staff. I was Walter Fauntroy's chief of staff in '83 and '84. Now, let me just simply say it didn't work out, and everything my father said was right. And with regard to Marion, when I left Fauntroy's staff in '85, I became the city's in-house lobbyist during Marion's second and third terms. He was unique. I will simply say that Marion was always dedicated to making sure that things got to people. And I think that's one of the reasons, as Cortland pointed out, why they did everything to drum him out, which is why we got a control board, was our city finances were not that bad. His style and desire and commitment to people has been missed since his absence. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, this is Tina Hobson. Well, I wanted to tell you that my early dates with Julius was going to speak against the Vietnam War. And I often dragged my boys with us because it was very important. And in 1969, the Hobson v. Wilson was started that involved both Abe Bloom and Arthur Waskow and Reverend David Eaton. And we were looking at peace. Julius was as interested in peace, and he was non-violent. He was in Italy during World War II, and he went up the boot. He worked in Italy as an arterial spotter. It was a segregated black-white war, but he came back totally opposed to wars in solving problems. And he was not violent. He was just non-violent, even though he said other things belonged to groups that didn't say that. But I knew it from the years that we were married, and I knew him from '67, and he died in '77. But I wanted to tell you that while he was in Italy, because he didn't drink alcohol, at night when other people went to bars in the military, he went to the opera. And he came home entertaining me with all the stories of the opera. Unfortunately, it wasn't something I dearly loved. He also, when he was up in a plane, memorized poetry, British poetry, because he had a book. So he could entertain me with British poetry. And he came back from the war with being able to talk about British poetry and opera. He was way more intelligent than I was, and I graduated from Stanford University in California. So it was fun to learn from Julius, and I did a lot. So I just wanted to thank you for doing this report, because he has been dead for 43 years. And the fact that his memory is just as acute as I still remember him. And I just wanted to thank you for what you have done, because in the first place, he was fun and he was humorous, and all the things that people have said. And I'm glad to have met the people who knew him when I didn't, because they have my opinion of him also. So thank you for inviting me.
I wanted to ask Debbie Hanrahan then if she could share some thoughts and memories of working with Julius Hobson.
First of all, it's probably the most interesting job I've ever had, and I'm an old lady and I've had a lot of jobs. It was dumb luck that got me into his office, but it certainly set the direction of my entire life. And I want to ask you, Parissa, just think if we had Julius Hobson today to talk about the runaway gentrification that is ruining our city, that is eating up our resources, that is using up our budgets. I mean, just think if we had somebody of his power that we could all work with and follow, because there is this vacuum now in the midst of an enormous problem. I mean, it's just, it confronts us at every level. And I miss him so much. We talk about an inside-outside approach to activism. You have people in the courts, that's the inside approach. Then you have the outsiders, the people on the streets, the people who are demonstrating, the people who are sitting in. Julius did both of them. Can you think of any other leader in today or even then who had mastered both approaches and was successful with both approaches?
What struck me with the film was some of his last comments in there. He talked about how he was just as outspoken against Black politicians' exploitation of Black residents as he was white politicians.
Right.
And that's something that I'm afraid is really lacking in the city. I think that we somehow want to act like it's not first of all, that racism is not a problem because we have Black elected officials. Well, of course it is, and systemic racism is a major problem. But also that we don't have actual, we have a class problem as well, which I think existed when Julius was doing this work as well, which is that we have a certain group of Black politicians that are looking down on a lot of our existing Black residents and acting as though their pain is not real, or that somehow their pain is just it's okay because the city is gonna is progressing in some way. And I think that Julius would have, I agree with you, I didn't have the pleasure of knowing him, but I think he would have been incensed and outspoken. And that's the other thing that I really appreciated seeing, is how he was not concerned with in fact, what he said about if I meet my maker, the only thing I'm going to be embarrassed by is that I wasn't more misbehaved, that I behaved too well. Right. And I think that was given the circumstances, he said, right? Given the circumstances, I've behaved too well. And I think that that's a mantra that we all need to take to heart, because if we are not being disruptors, then really what are we doing, right?
And first, if I could just jump in to comment on what you're stating, that I think him studying Marxism, early on in his career, I think was very, very important in terms of just having a different critique and analysis of this idea of capitalism. Because the problem with capitalism in terms of how it operates, it doesn't discriminate, ironically, in terms of race. In other words, if you can have Black, Indigenous people of color in these positions, still operating this machinery in a way that is still destructive to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So what do I mean? And I think when you look at, for example, just recent current events, many of us on this call would have found it very difficult to foresee the day in which Barack Obama would have been elected in 2008. How revolutionary was that, right? But at the same time, when I think Cortland Coxon may mention some of these names. When you think about Michael Brown, when you think about Oscar Grant, when you think about, right, Trayvon Martin, wait a minute. These were people who ended up being the genesis of hashtag Black Lives Matter. That started on whose? Obama's watch, right? So just because you have a black face in a high place, that doesn't mean that you've revolutionized the system, right? So in other words, the system was still operating as it was designed to do, right? Which is, and unfortunately, destructive for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So just because Obama was in office, that didn't stop the show. And I think Hobson in his advocacy reminds us of how we have to remain consistent, right? You know, in terms of our critique and critically analyzing how the whole is affected, right? You know, and I think, you know, the only travesty is, and I think Ms. Tina Hobson said it, this idea that 43 years later, his advocacy is still as acute. Well, I guess my only question is, why does it take us 43 years to realize, right? You know, and in terms of, you know, oftentimes, so many outliers, you know, during the time period in which, you know, they're advocating is difficult for people to really understand and embrace them. It's only after the fact where we say, oh, wow, I think, you know, they must have been on to something, you know, they made a really great point. But oftentimes, you know, the window has closed.
We were throwing names into the hat, and we must never forget Josephine Butler. But Tina had mentioned something to me, which I had talked to her about, and that gets back to your point about truth to power.
Yeah, right.
Hobson never hesitated to talk truth to power, including whoever, and that's what we don't have today. We are trimming our sails, and he never did that, and that is what's getting us into trouble.
Well, and if I could jump in here just for a minute, because the topic of gentrification, much on my mind. We had Dr. Andre Puri talk at noon today at Trinity about the home ownership issue and, you know, the problem of the wealth gap, the Black-white wealth gap. And we were talking about solutions like paying off student debt and, you know, how can we make it possible for more young Black women and men to purchase. But the problem is, as we pointed out, here in DC, you know, I'm up here in the Brookland Edgewood neighborhood. You can't buy anything for under $1 million right now in this neighborhood, you know, which where you used to be able to buy something nice for 150, 200,000. So even if we wipe out all the student loan debt, it still is impossible to purchase a home, and home ownership is one of the fastest ways a person can build wealth and can get on the wealth track. The problem is there's a lack of political willpower when the politicians, you know, and I don't want to name names, but when in fact the politicians are co-opted by the developers, if you will, when there is a refusal to discuss issues of poverty and racism, you know, and systemic racism in home ownership, and how decisions get made about land use in the city, then you are in fact putting yourself in a position where not only is it impossible for the rising generation of Black citizens in the city to own homes, in fact, the city is bleaching out. And so the city is now becoming predominantly white, and the political power structure is becoming predominantly white. So you actually lose power even as the city on surface economically is improving. It's a subject that our students at Trinity are very interested in and very concerned about. And the question becomes, where is the next Julius Hobson? You know, where is that political spine to call out what needs to be called out? Can you make progress economically as a city together while not leaving so many of your citizens behind?
We have this problem of just a real veneer, right? It's like this window dressing of racial equity. Everybody wants to talk about racial equity, but yet apply it to programs that do nothing to actually change people's economic conditions, to actually transfer wealth, resources, and power, which is the only way we're going to be able to, you know, repair the harm that's been done.
This is Julius Jr. I want to say something else to add on to what Tina said. she mentioned the court suit against the FBI. Most people don't realize how much we were under surveillance in the 60s. And it was after that case that was resolved that I got to read my FBI file, which was started when I was 14 years old.
Oh my gosh.
And I will simply say when I was an undergraduate, when I turned 18, the draft board was after me. So when I got to Howard, I signed up for Advanced Army ROTC. So I went through all 4 years. I came back from summer camp at Indiantown Gap Military Reservation and got hauled in by military intelligence for 2 days. And they, you thought they would asking me about whatever. I'd earned a right for a regular Army commission, and they spent 2 days asking me about my father. There were a lot of us who grew up who were the sons and daughters of some of those first city council members, and I do have to add Willie Hardy and Nadine Winter in that bunch. Yeah. And all of them were activists, and all of them were always under surveillance, and yet they persisted in trying to make things better. From my perch as working for both Fontroy and the mayor, and for Marion when he was the mayor, the resistance continued. And I think it's unfortunate we don't have that today.
I want to say that Julius Hobson was part of a cohort of people, particularly people who came out of World War II, Black soldiers, who, after fighting for freedom abroad, decided that they were not going to take what they saw at home. So you're talking about Medgar Evers and people like that. And so, so he wasn't just an individual, he was a cohort. Mm-hmm. We came behind you. I was 20 years younger than Julius, 21, maybe something like that, and, we also saw what was going on, and we learned, and, the people who helped us understand the world, as I mentioned, Ms. Hamer, Bayard Rustin, people like that, they helped us understand the world. And so my sense is that there was a clarity. I think you mentioned that he did the legal, he did also the demonstration, but also Julius was an intellectual. And the big difference with Julius as an intellectual, and don't take this of, most intellectuals stay at the university and the academy, but he got in the streets. And so he was a triple threat in the sense that he not only did that. So, my sense is that the big thing that was important for us is that first, you had the cohort that challenged each other and fed off each other. So it was not only, Julius was doing something here in Washington, but somebody was doing something in Mississippi, somebody was doing something in Alabama. They took the time to speak to us and to help get us focused and so forth. Let me just say that while I think that between the 70s and to 2012, you had a different kind of development. You had the development of electoral politics in terms of the Black community. You had professors, you had people in business and so forth. That kind of class and so forth group developed. Now, 2012 with Trayvon Martin, I don't know what reasons, it started again, the whole demonstration, the whole Black Lives Matter piece. And I have a great deal of confidence that at some point, 5, 6, 7, 8 years from now, there will be a group of Julius Hobsons and Marion Barrys and Johnny Wilsons and Douglas Moore. Don't forget Douglas Moore.
There's another one.
Yep. So my sense is they're coming, and I take heart that that whole generation is going to be very disruptive to this society.
We're about out of time. I know that there's somebody named Gilbert Douglas on the line who wanted to say something. He was in core with Julius. Is Gilbert still on?
This has been a very interesting discussion. I noted, though, that it has caused the period really in 1967, 68, when I went back to college. I had been a college dropout. I'm native Washingtonian, born here, raised here, went to Banneker when it was junior high school. What impressed me most with working with Julius was I got a job in Chevy Chase at Western Avenue as a Christmas salesman in the men's department. And I attributed that to some demonstrations that Court had downtown with Hecht's department store in Landsberg and so forth, and Woody's. And I went to a core meeting at All Souls Unitarian Church. And when the meeting was over, I said, I attributed Core's prior demonstrations to my getting hired for the Christmas season. And I wanted to join Core, give them some money back. How could I pay for membership? And the whole room broke off in laughter because there was no membership. So anyhow, I made a small donation and became a member of it. And we picketed otherwise in Adams Morgan in front of Safeway, Columbia stores on Columbia Road. I led a picket line a couple of blocks away west of that. And we went from Court to also, I went to work for the State Department later.
I was honored to have been a co-plaintiff with Julius in a lawsuit, a civil rights lawsuit against the FBI and the Metropolitan Police Department. And I think that Tina mentioned this in passing. So Julius was a man who also believed in privacy, and the FBI and the Metropolitan Police Department had spied and infiltrated on political activists, both civil rights activists. I was an anti-war activist, a very young anti-war activist. And he filed a lawsuit, which is called Hobson versus Wilson, in which he challenged. Julius believed in the Constitution, and he believed in individual rights. And this was a lawsuit that was Julius versus Wilson. And he not only won in the US District Court, but he won in the Supreme Court of the United States to say forever that infiltration by police agents, whether FBI or at the local level, who had done nothing wrong except that they wanted to protest or speak their minds, that was unconstitutional in America. And that was a landmark that Julius has left for our country. And it's not a really well-known part of his history, but it's one that we should all really admire and really realize how precious he was. I think it was Tina or it was Julius Jr. who said he believed in the Constitution. He did believe in the Constitution. He believed that we had rights, and he exercised them. He went all the way to the Supreme Court. So I just want to say it was an honor to have been a plaintiff with him and with the other members of the group. And it's just, he has left, it's a living legacy that he did this one little piece, which many people probably don't know. And that's all I want to say.